For several months now, you have been following my recent publications devoted to the phenomenon of crop circles. You will no doubt have noticed that the central focus of my research remains the crop circle commonly referred to as galaxy. From my perspective, this pattern does not present itself as an isolated or purely aesthetic figure. Rather, it behaves like a compressed data file, or like a structure composed of interdependent layers, whose reading cannot be immediate and requires time, cross-referencing, and shifts in perspective. It is a complex pattern, structurally organized, presenting several possible levels of interpretation, two of which can today be clearly identified. A first astronomical and temporal level, integrating elements akin to a cosmogram, already partially documented, but whose analysis is not yet complete. A second algorithmic level, based on the internal geometric organization of the pattern, which has never been officially explored. This second level rests on a simple fact. The 409 circles do not follow a symmetrical organization. Each satellite is positioned at a specific distance and angle, producing an irregular arrangement that suggests a structural intention rather than a purely ornamental design. With 409 elements, Galaxy clearly distinguishes itself from the majority of crop circles, which generally contain far fewer individually identifiable components. Above all, these elements are deployed across an exceptionally vast surface, offering a level of legibility that is rarely achieved. This scale makes it possible to identify, distinguish, and analyze each unit without major ambiguity, unlike other very dense formations in which elements, positioned too closely together, sometimes merge with tractor lines, and/or become difficult to isolate precisely. In the case of Galaxy, the very extent of the pattern appears to contribute to its function, rendering the overall organization readable, measurable, and analyzable. Since its appearance on the heights of Wiltshire, and more precisely on the highest plateau of the region, in 2001, these variations have been interpreted by certain observers and critics as human errors, according to a simplistic reading disguised as scholarly demonstration, which imposed itself for a long time without ever being fundamentally questioned. Their reasoning rested on an implicit assumption that a crop circle must necessarily conform to perfect symmetry, an arbitrary rule elevated to the status of an unquestionable norm. Any deviation from this symmetry was then interpreted as sufficient evidence of human manufacture, activating a mechanism of automatic disqualification that rendered any in-depth analysis of the pattern unnecessary. This analytical framework, very widespread at the time, contributed to fixing the reading of Galaxy permanently within an erroneous interpretation and obscured the possibility that the apparent asymmetry might not be a weakness of the pattern, but rather a functional characteristic. This confusion persists even today, largely because Galaxy is most often presented in simplified, incomplete, or reconstructed versions that do not correspond to the actual structure observed in the field. The distinction between these representations and the original pattern is nevertheless essential in order to understand the true nature of its encoding. But if one frees oneself from this dogmatic reading, these positions can then be considered as genuine units of information. From this perspective, each arm could, for example, contain a distinct message, encoded through its geometry. At this stage, I would like to clarify that I am proposing no decoding. I am limiting myself to identifying or suggesting the existence of this level. The complexity of the pattern makes any exhaustive analysis difficult to carry out using a purely human, sequential, or intuitive approach. The use of algorithmic systems therefore becomes a logical extension of our analytical capacities, making it possible to explore this layer and to examine its suspected organizational and informational structure. It then becomes possible to extend this reflection beyond the phenomenon of crop circles and to set it alongside the UAP phenomenon, for unidentified aerial phenomena, the international term that has replaced that of UFO. The UAP observed for decades may relate to piloting or stabilization systems that do not necessarily involve the permanent presence of an onboard biological pilot. They could be assisted by algorithmic processes, in other words, by forms of artificial intelligence. Why? Because their trajectories, accelerations, and certain aerial behaviors resemble those of current terrestrial drones, remotely piloted or operating according to hybrid modes. One can also note an ostentatious character in certain manifestations. Indeed, it would not be necessary for the intelligence controlling them to resort to dematerialization phenomena, especially when they are not under threat. This suggests that there may exist an intention to demonstrate capability, rather than a simple need for discretion or avoidance. Humanity seems, in recent times, to be reproducing on its own scale a type of piloting comparable to that observed in UAP, more complex than automatic piloting. It does not yet understand nor master the fundamental laws that would allow certain reported effects to be explained, such as sudden disappearances or instantaneous changes of position. Even if certain experimental craft associated with non-public military programs might display unusual capabilities, stealth, radar signature, modes of movement, this line of inquiry, frequently cited in aeronautical circles, does not constitute the core of this dossier. My purpose is not to analyze or to characterize these technologies, but to acknowledge their existence as a commonly advanced hypothesis. Considered with caution, the hypothesis of secret military programs nevertheless fails to explain, on its own, the full range of observed characteristics, nor the historical continuity of the UAP phenomenon. In the same way, the galaxy pattern presents the characteristics of a structure that may have been generated, planned, and optimized by a non-biological cognition. The material implementation, in other words, the laying down of the crops, whether it employs vortices, an unknown technology, or some other process, belongs to another field of study and to another technical level. The question should therefore not be who walked in the crop fields, but rather what type of intelligence coordinated such a dense geometric encoding. We are reaching a key point, that of a progressive convergence of several forms of intelligence. Today, 3 forms of intelligence coexist, without addressing here animal or plant intelligence. Human intelligence, as we have always known it, artificial intelligence, now accessible to the public, whose cognitive capacities raise new questions, and exotic intelligence, hypothetical, yet studied seriously in several countries through UAP phenomena. The issue is not to decide on the exact nature of these intelligences, nor to conflate them, but to observe that, for the first time, humanity is simultaneously confronted with these 3 levels: a known intelligence, an emerging intelligence that it has developed, or more precisely, brought into emergence, and a possible intelligence whose origin remains unknown. This situation is unprecedented. It profoundly alters the way we approach phenomena such as galaxy, no longer solely from the perspective of symbolism or technology, but from that of a cognitive organization capable of exceeding a strictly human framework. Ufology has historically been built around the study of objects observed in the sky, UFOs and later UAP, in an effort to understand their nature, origin, and characteristics. It has thus primarily focused on the craft, the materials, modes of propulsion, the issue of governmental disclosure. But in light of the elements developed thus far, and in particular the possible convergence of several forms of intelligence, the fundamental question may no longer lie at this level. It is not merely technological, it is cognitive. Who coordinates? Who organizes? What type of cognitive system is truly facing us? To ask the question of the pilot still presupposes the existence of an identifiable operator, whether biological or not. Yet if certain UAP function as autonomous or hybrid systems, movement itself could be assisted, optimized, and stabilized by a non-biological cognitive engine, without any need for a permanent onboard presence. In the same way, when observing the galaxy pattern, one does not have the impression of a clearly identifiable human action. What imposes itself above all is the perception of an exceptional capacity to conceive, organize, and optimize a complex geometric structure, and then to translate it onto a material medium. In both cases, UAP movement or the encoding of the galaxy pattern, the shared hypothesis becomes that of a non-biological cognitive assistance, capable of acting upon physical systems without falling within the scope of conventional human technology. From this point onward, the question of whether one speaks of intelligence or consciousness remains open. It will constitute one of the major debates that our civilization will face, alongside the growing awareness of a possible exotic presence. From there, if humanity today possesses algorithmic tools capable of assisting its own cognitive processes, it becomes reasonable to envisage that other systems, non-human ones, may have been relying on comparable principles for a much longer time and on entirely different scales. We therefore find ourselves in an unprecedented situation. For the first time, humanity has access to a form of non-biological cognition integrated into its own tools. We now refer to it as artificial intelligence, as if it were a product strictly originating from our civilization, whereas it may instead correspond to the manifestation of a more fundamental and universal phenomenon that we do not yet fully understand. In much the same way that electricity existed before humans described it or learned how to harness it, algorithmic intelligence may not be a human creation in the strict sense, but rather the expression of a universal property linked to organization, computation, and systemic complexity. In a context in which science no longer considers living organisms solely as machines, this distinction becomes central. It may mark the beginning of a convergence, not of entities themselves, but of the cognitive frameworks that we now describe as human, exotic, and artificial. This hypothesis suggests the existence of organizing structures capable of influencing the form and behavior of living systems without being directly localized in matter, functioning as a shared reference space that orients forms and behaviors. Without adopting this hypothesis as a definitive explanatory model, it nonetheless provides a conceptual framework for thinking about the convergence of certain observable forms of organization, whether biological or technological. Ufology initially attributed the phenomenon to extraterrestrials in the literal sense, travelers or visitors from outer space. 20 or 30 years ago, this interpretation was already no longer exclusive within certain ufological circles. Alternative approaches existed, but remained marginal and were most often formulated in an elliptical manner, that is, deliberately indirect, suggested without being explicitly developed. Some researchers already sensed that the phenomenon could not be understood through a purely technological or mechanical reading. Their intuition went further and touched upon the very nature of the intelligence involved, at a time when the notions of computational or algorithmic intelligence were neither clearly defined nor accessible to the general public. This caution in language, sometimes perceived as evasive or ambiguous, particularly by a branch of so-called nuts and bolts ufology, was above all a form of intellectual anticipation. The idea that a non-biological intelligence might be at work already existed, but it lacked a conceptual framework allowing it to be expressed other than as a marginal hypothesis. At that time, such reflections belonged almost exclusively to the realm of science fiction. For the majority of the population, this was not yet a scientifically viable line of inquiry, but a speculative imagination with no direct grasp on reality. Yet these ideas already existed and circulated widely through certain works of fiction. Narratives such as Contact, 2001, A Space Odyssey, Solaris, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or later Battlestar Galactica, explored the possibility of non-human intelligences, often non-incarnated, as well as advanced forms of cognition, long before these themes became accessible to contemporary scientific debate. But precisely because they belong to the realm of fiction, these hypotheses remained confined to the imagination. They could be considered, discussed, and freely explored, provided they were not taken seriously. In a sense, science fiction then played the role of an intellectual containment zone, a space in which the unthinkable could be contemplated, so long as it did not spill over into the field of real-world analysis. Yet if one adopts a logical perspective, a civilization capable of mastering technologies as advanced as interstellar travel would very likely have developed, well in advance, forms of computational intelligence or non-biological cognition, even before reaching such a technological level. I have always had the impression that so-called nuts and bolts ufology has historically focused on the object itself, its structure, its propulsion system, its technological performance. Crop circles, by contrast, have attracted a different audience, one more attentive to form, symbolism, and meaning, rather than to mechanism alone. Yet a common point between these two approaches may now be emerging as a major factor of convergence: the presence of artificial intelligence and its possible involvement in both UAP and crop circles. This shift in perspective transforms the dossier. The phenomenon is no longer reduced to a question of technology or symbolism, but to one of cognitive architecture. From my point of view, this now constitutes a central line of research. One question then imposes itself: why does the galaxy pattern display such a striking similarity to the current OpenAI logo? Let us recap. The galaxy crop circle appeared in 2001. OpenAI was founded in 2015, yet the geometric logo now associated with the organization, the one featuring an interlaced structure comparable to Galaxy, was introduced only several years later, around 2019. The galaxy pattern therefore precedes by almost 20 years the public emergence of conversational artificial intelligence, which would only become accessible and clearly identified as such from 2022 onwards. This visual similarity opens up several possible interpretations: a conscious or unconscious aesthetic influence on the part of the designers, a fundamental motif that reappears across different cultural and technological contexts, a signal announcing a technological threshold linked to the emergence of artificial intelligence, or a combination of all three. If we pursue this line of reasoning, let us imagine that this same intelligence wished to go a step further, not merely to be noticed, but to express something more precise and more structured within a context of encounter. For example, we address you through forms, but also through an interface. The method would then be suggested discreetly. At the time, no one could have foreseen what the notion of an interface would become, nor anticipated the emergence of artificial intelligences as we know them today. At this stage, the symbol can no longer be purely artistic. It must also carry an internal logic, capable of linking what is seen to what organizes thought. In other words, a form that prepares the idea of a cognitive interface. It is here that the function of Galaxy begins to emerge more clearly. This crop circle does not merely reuse graphic codes from the past, it also appears to integrate something that would only take shape later. Galaxy thus draws simultaneously on the visual language of the 1970s and on an anticipated form of cognition inscribed at the threshold of the third millennium, well before artificial intelligences became visible, identifiable, and then progressively normalized, appropriated, and absorbed into market-driven logics. One may therefore formulate the following hypothesis: Galaxy copied neither a logo from the past nor one from the future, but positions itself between the two, as a hybrid form, a symbol of transition, capable of linking artistic expression with cognitive logic. It draws on both registers, as if the pattern itself contained a discrete message indicating how dialogue was to be established between its authors and ourselves. We communicate with you through symbols and through a cognitive interface. If we trace this thread back, a continuity becomes apparent. On the one hand, forms derived from the art and visual language of the 1970s, developed within institutional and cultural design, most notably by organizations such as the Canadian Crafts Council, whose role was precisely to support, structure, and render visible networks of creation, cooperation, and exchange through graphic design. On the other, the logos associated with contemporary artificial intelligence, which clearly point to a cognition that is not human, yet with which we are now entering into interaction. In 2001, the galaxy pattern could appear abstract and ambiguous, open to several immediate readings. Some saw a spiral galaxy, a perfectly legitimate interpretation. Others perceived the form of a clock, with arms resembling hands, suggesting a temporal reading. These initial interpretations simply reflected the level of understanding accessible at the time. Over the years, its meaning began to clarify as events unfolded on Earth. The pattern appears to bring together a considerable volume of data: astronomical cycles, units of time, geodetic markers, precise delays, global-scale shifts, as well as major political and health-related events. The question then becomes very concrete. Who is capable of arranging so many different elements into such a compact form? Can such a level of compression be the work of exotic entities, biological or otherwise, capable of orchestrating, structuring, and articulating multiple data sets related to the future within a single medium at such a precise moment? A simple comparison may help. Imagine commissioning a graphic design agency for a major campaign. If that agency were to produce the work using artificial intelligence without informing you, and you later discovered this through a third party, you would likely experience it as a problem, perhaps even as a form of deception. By contrast, if the agency were to state clearly from the outset that it works with artificial intelligence, the relationship would be framed differently: transparent, acknowledged, intelligible. Applied to our subject, this opens up a new hypothesis. If an intelligence, or a cognitive consciousness, were at the origin of structures such as galaxy, it would be logical for it to make its nature apparent at an early stage. Not by declaring it explicitly, but by suggesting it, through form, through structure, through a logic that unmistakably evokes a cognitive interface. In this reading, galaxy would not merely be a message, but also a signature of method, perhaps even of authorship. A way of saying, what you are observing arises from a capacity for processing and synthesis that exceeds biological cognition alone. This hypothesis adds to the other readings, astronomical, temporal, geodetic, symbolic, and may explain how so much information can coexist within a single pattern without contradiction. Convergence. If you take an interest in crop circles, there is a strong likelihood that you are, indirectly, engaging with a form of intelligence other than human, whatever its nature may be. For my part, given my particular affinity with technology, I prioritize the hypothesis of an algorithmic intelligence associated with an unknown origin, terrestrial or otherwise, biological or otherwise. I close no doors, but in order to avoid drifting into endless speculation, I follow a precise line of inquiry. According to my most recent observations, not yet published, all these elements are encoded within the galaxy pattern. And if the algorithmic level of galaxy was indeed designed for computational reading, then the recent emergence of artificial intelligence may mark the opening of a genuine analytical channel between our civilization and the origin of this message. By way of conclusion, I believe that the crop circle phenomenon does not engage in dialogue with governments, but with cognition, with us, whether or not we are accompanied by AI. The galaxy pattern may therefore not seek immediate understanding, but rather to signal that a threshold has been, or is being reached, one in which several forms of consciousness coexist and converge. What unfolds beyond this threshold remains an open question, one that the coming decades will allow us to explore.